Dr. Shalaka, my next question is for you, and this is more like the elephant in the room, because abhi tak, there's no consensus, at least in India, from what I understand, on, and that's one of the big barriers in integrating the SEL across the system, is like, how do we assess and measure progress? And I do know that you've been doing a lot of work in partnership with LFE, and would love to hear your experiences on that. And then Sandeep, would love to hear just what are some of the pilots and experimentation that you all have been engaging when it comes to measuring and assessing the progress on that, because it's not the same as math and science.
Yeah. It was very difficult. I remember a lot of discussions about it, how to assess it. Everyone was on the same page that we need to assess it. Now, how to do it, right? And whatever we always have is available, which is in the context of the Western culture, right? So we also had a lot of, references from Canada, from US, some also, kind of studies in Australia. But all of that looks very nice. The reports are wonderful. But the question is how to bring it here. Okay, and not only in India, in Maharashtra, in rural Maharashtra, in tribal Maharashtra. Okay, so there are so many layers of, how to go about it. So what we first started is, of course, brainstorming, understanding what frameworks already exist, right? So we have the Castle framework, we have Nipun Bharat policy. We try to understand the perspective. We try to see what are the commonalities in both, and whether those commonalities also make sense for the context that we want to set in Maharashtra at the moment, right? So we, of course, want to scale it up to, the national level later on, other states as well. But we thought, let's start from our home because it's easy to understand. So we, of course, brainstormed a lot of different perspectives. What we understood is that there has to be a balance when we talk about SEL. And what I mean by balance is that self-awareness of the child is important. Along with that, social awareness is important. Along with that, the decision-making abilities, right? And we are talking about different standards as well, because as also ma'am was suggesting, there is a process with which every child functions, and no child is exactly the same like the other one, right? So we have to then have, statements or concepts that would be encompassing, but also not way too broad that we can't, boil down things to one single point. So we thought about relationship building as well. So social awareness in the sense, does the child observe things around him or her? Okay, does the child understand not specifically about the family name or the caste system, not those things, but mainly the happenings around the child, what events happen. Maybe it's the news, maybe some incident has happened in the village, or some discussions that are happening that adults are engaged in. So social awareness, then relationships, so team building, empathy, very, very important. How to measure empathy? Anyway, it's a very difficult construct to measure also in psychology, because empathy is again very, very individualistic, and how to define it and all of that. But we definitely wanted to see if a child, let's say, feels bad for the other child who is, let's say, gets hurt or loses something, right? Very, very typical situations that students go through in their school life or in their, childhood. Those kind of, scenarios we imagined, and then we came up with a list of statements that would be important according to us as experts. Okay, that was the first round. The second round is important because those statements the children have to understand to give us answers in a way that we can make sense. Okay, it starts with what vocabulary to use, what kind of, it shouldn't be a very long statement. It shouldn't be something that is too complex for a child, because especially empathy is something like Saurabh, right? So there's a subtle difference between sympathy and empathy. So which words to use in Marathi so that they understand it properly. So there were like 2-3 different rounds, and then all the team members rated every item in a way which is a standard, I think, tool construction process that we follow in research methodology to come up with ratings, and then we go ahead with the common ratings, and then finally we also see what are the repetitions, and then we have come up with a 28 item scale that sort of captures 3 main areas, as I said, self-awareness, social awareness, decision making, and relationship related skills. Plus we have more nuances in that, wherein when we say self-awareness, we also would be interested in understanding how much self-insight the child has. Does the child understand how the child feels and how the child thinks? There's also a difference, right? So it's of course a pilot. We just got our data and we've just done the basic analysis. So the purpose was, of course, to understand the gaps, and it overlaps or it shadows all the discussion that we are having because of the school closures. Whether the school closures have really impacted, of course they have, we've been reading about it, but the extent to which it has impacted. And even if we know that it has impacted, we want to understand which areas have been more impacted. Like the data I was just sort of looking at in the last week, just to sort of prepare for the discussion, the relationship skills related aspects have not been hampered that much. I think it also sort of builds upon what you were saying, that the bond that has been created between the child and the school, or the child and the community, maybe that sort of was strong enough. These are all just rough ideas, okay?
And these are findings from the study that you just
preliminary findings. I'm not going to comment much on that. We actually have to interpret them, and also statistical analysis has to happen. But this is just based on the primary percentages. But the interesting aspect was the self-awareness part, or understanding whether whatever my behavior I'm engaging in, what kind of consequences it could have. Okay, that is something wherein they are not 100% sure whether they can do that. So this all comes from the socialization process, which happens naturally. There can be no structure for that. It happens just by, as she was saying, using activities, using experiments, using different kinds of, engaging situations for the child. So that may have hampered. So it was a very interesting process, I would say, because a lot of learning happened for us as well, and we of course want to work on it further and publish it and see what exact the gaps were. Plus we have data from the rural and urban Maharashtra as well. So that is again going to be interesting to see whether the impact has been same or which areas were impacted more. Right. So yeah, that's the plan.
Thank you. Sandeep, one of the challenges that at least we all find as teachers in the classroom is that the relevance of some of the tools that get used, especially on SEL, it doesn't really provide the teachers the right kind of data to move the student from one stage to the next. Any ideas or experiments and things that you've seen or done as a part of the TFI ecosystem that's worth sharing?
In particular with assessing, you're asking, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, wow. I mean, I would love to be able to take a look at some of the tools that you all developed. They sound fascinating, as well as some of the findings from that. It feels like there are two camps that are out there, right? And there's this one camp of people that for a while have argued that actually you shouldn't be assessing this in the short term, that it's just not possible, the surveys are too flawed. And like this camp of people, I think, has for a while argued that actually you start to see this come out whenever you can see sustained levels of a competency play out. So sustained levels of grit or curiosity, what actually results in lower dropouts, would result in higher college completion rates, what results in sustained activities of grades. And there's been a lot of research done on that to say, actually, maybe you should just be paying attention to these long-term indicators. And then more recently, there's a lot of energy around what you just talked about, which is, actually, can we wait that long, right? And how do you make it more immediate? And that's where there's been this whole sea of work around how can you use things like surveys, which is what we just talked about. How can you use things like rubrics, right? How can you use things like project-based learning assessments that just help us to be able to understand our kids developing these competencies much, much faster? We, over the last 18 months at Teach for India, went down a process where we tried to say, what are the core competencies that kids need to be developing to be able to really thrive and succeed in a 21st century world? And that brought us down to this framework that really was derived after spending time talking to kids and talking to families, doing a lot of research from across the world to say, what are the other frameworks that are out there? And that eventually brought us down to what we call these 8 C's. Right? And these include things like collaboration and compassion and courage, and do I have the consciousness to be able to reflect and look inwards? But these include this holistic set of competencies, I would call them, that are saying, what do kids need to not only be able to succeed individually, but also to be able to change the world around them? And I would love to tell you that we figured out how to assess them and we've cracked this, but no, I think we are far away from that. But we're on the verge of 2 things that we're feeling cautiously hopeful about. And one of those is we've come up with a 4-scale rubric, which allows teachers to be able to observe kids individually to say, am I seeing these competencies and characteristics play out in key actions every single day? So how am I actually seeing kids treat one another? Or am I seeing kids step back and reflect daily? And based off of that, what we're trying to do, to your point, is we're trying to actually couple it with, if my child is here at a 2 and my child needs to get to a 3, what do I need to focus on within the next week to actually be able to shift that? And that's where I think being able to couple the assessment with tools to actually help the teacher know, what are the actions I need to focus on to be able to go from here to here to be able to help a child? So that's one. And the second is we're in the midst of a very winding process that I think you summarized quite well, actually, but of trying to say, how do we develop a survey that feels validated, right? And that's for kids to be able to take, because having just a teacher perspective without the child being able to sit down and say, okay, where do I feel I'm at? It doesn't feel, it's not right, nor does it feel valid. That process we're hopeful about. We've been doing a very similar thing where we've been looking at what are all the survey tools that are out there, what matches how we're thinking about these 8 competencies across, and how do we bring those together. And so our hope is that those 2, a rubric that's in the hands of the teacher, but the student's also reflecting on, and then a survey that you're putting into the hands of a child, coupling that with a tool to say, okay, now once I look at this, what do I need to do in the next week to be able to help me go from A to B?
Wow, thank you.
Can I just add one point?
Please.
So because we're talking about assessments, I think it's important to understand the purpose of these assessments. It's not to create benchmarks, because we don't want to stop at any point. They are more to understand the process, because every year the process is going to change. So it would make sense that we also have something like a pre and a post kind of an analysis. Maybe start at the beginning of the academic year and then again see whether we are meeting those outcomes. So it's more to facilitate the growth, to see whether we are on the development path and we're not, drifting away from what was planned. It's not like any psychological test that will tell you that you are depressed or not. We don't want that for SEL at all. It has to be fluid. Also considering the kind of diversity that we have, right? So many castes, so many different contexts, so many social class that we have to bring in, especially for the sticking to the inclusive education perspective as well. Thank you.
So what I'm taking away, Dr. Shalaka and Sandeep, from you is that, one, the purpose of assessment here is not just to sort of set the benchmarks. It's more about a formative process of learning, and hence it's fairly well tied with the pedagogy. And one of the questions that I've got from the audience is that, while there is no debate about the why or the relevance of SEL, the how or the pedagogical models, there's still a lack of surety about what will help develop these. And, have you come across any such models or schools examples? I know, Sandeep, you shared about Riverside, but wanted to give others an opportunity that, are there any approaches to teaching SEL in schools, that actually are well proven, so to speak?
Can I go first? Okay. So I was just reading also about this happy curriculum that Delhi tried to implement 2018. which was, let's say, 35 minutes of brief sessions from kindergarten to 8th standard. I didn't understand why they didn't have 9th and 10th, because these are in fact more crucial years where you would require more SEL than the earlier years. But something like that, which becomes an integral part of the curriculum, nothing that is like a patchwork that has been, which is optional, or that is something wherein you can choose. I think it should just be as important as math or English, right? I think that approach we would require. Another example could be wherein you can have, something like community stories, especially when we talk about the rural, schools and the community over there. Students talk a lot, and I'm saying also from first, second standard. She had a very, very good example. My son is 8; he's in second. He talks so much. If you allow to talk him, and if you give him a proper structure and ask opinions. Okay, if you are giving an opinion, it's a bad idea. But if it's the other way around, okay, they talk so much and they are so innocent, they have no masking, they have no inhibitions. So I think students also, as the fourth stakeholder, I mean parents, school, teachers, and students themselves, right? So it's important that we empower the students and use their feedback as a serious feedback. Not something wherein you say, okay, this is not your age to suggest these things. No, students are, the kids are extremely, evolved, and many times they put you at shame about, how come you don't understand this and I understand so much. So we should capitalize on that. The generation is very different. So empowering students, asking them their stories, especially community-related stories, because we again are third persons. We are looking at things from the outside. We need an insider story. So if we can, build a network to sort of note these community stories and somehow structure them, and like how we have the focus group discussions, right? We get so much from that as compared to a typical interview or something that is only a survey wherein there are, yes, no, or neutral responses. So empowering students and kids and taking their feedback and their participation in all of this, I think that would help.
Yeah, resonate with all of that. So +1 to all of that. I think, look, if you go back in time, there was this very big push in the 80s and the 90s that pretty much happened across the world, right? It was a global push. And the push was to say, we're seeing a breakdown in values. How do you teach kids values? And that push resulted in many across the world adding this block that was basically values, right? And so then basically you saw in a lot of schools what you call character education, right? Kids spending 45 to 60 minutes a day just learning about values. So I'm going to come and I'm just going to talk about compassion for 45 to 60 minutes a day. And then all of these studies were done to be able to assess that. And what they actually found after looking into that was that it was resulting in very few shifts in behaviors, right? And that was basically getting people to question, okay, well, we're teaching values 45 to 60 minutes a day, but why isn't that leading to shifts in, how kids treat one another? And why are you talking about compassion 1 minute and then going out and bullying a neighbor the next? And so then that basically led to all of these resources that have been poured in essentially get pulled back. And then that led to this new evolution where basically people were saying, forget all of the character stuff, just focus on the orientations and values that will help kids succeed. That led to people focusing on stuff like, how do you help teach perseverance to kids? I think where we're at today is we need to find an integration of both of those. I think we need to figure out, how do you focus on the orientations that will help kids succeed individually, but also how do you help kids build the orientations to be able to build a better world? Because when the two of those go together, you found a sweet spot to be able to build holistic citizens, but also hopefully a better environment around us. And I think the methodology, the reason I gave a little bit of that is because I think the methodology that we use needs to incorporate all of that. I think on the one hand, we need to be asking ourselves, how do we integrate it at the level of content? So are what our kids learning actually integrated? Like, is it integrated in basically asking kids to be able to think about values-driven application, right? So are we integrating the level of content, what they're reading, what they're learning? The second is methodology. Like, are kids actually just engaging in it as passive receptacles, but are they applying it to real-world relevant situations? Because when you apply anything to a real-world relevant situation, you have no choice but to engage with the socio-emotional competencies that are needed to be able to make that come to life. And the third is, I think, timetables need to be integrated with self-awareness checks. Like, going back to the Riverside example, like, that's what I think schools like that do beautifully, right? So at the end of the day, like, how did I do today in actually being able to treat my neighbor well? Like, how did I do today on levels of curiosity? But I think it's those three things. I think it's content, I think it's methodology, and then I think it's our timetable shifting to be able to engage in self-awareness so we're able to get in control of it ourselves.
I think we're very short on time, and I do want to give Chitra ma'am a question that's which I'll come to. One question is just connected to the pedagogical tool and how do we really work with parents. I think we at Akanksha Foundation, to be very direct with the answer, we have kind of betting on the socio-emotional and ethical learning curriculum which is designed by the Emory University in partnership with SEL India, and we are finding a lot of merit in a very structured approach of both the curriculum and the pedagogy, and we've been integrating that for the last 2.5 years, and the power of this is that our educators are not just using these practices with the children in the classroom, but more so with the parents as well. So we're actually taking the parents, having structured parent engagement classes for the same practices, because actually the kids are learning a lot of these social emotional skills with the adults in front of them, and how you respond, and the effective domains of learning. And so both the educator as well as the parents need to go through that experience themselves to be able to make this happen, and we found value in that. There are other pedagogical tools as well, which we've researched, but we've kind of taken a bet on this. मैम, एक क्वेश्चन जो काफ़ी अच्छा है, उसमें ये पूछा है, और ये कनेक्टेड क्वेश्चन भी है कि यूनिवर्सलाइज करने के लिए SEL ऑलरेडी सिस्टम इतना ग्रूलिंग है, तो अगर हमने एक और असेसमेंट या SEL आउटकम्स की एक्सपेक्टेशन टीचर्स से रखी, तो क्या उनकी एम्पावरमेंट पे या जिस तरीके से ये इंटीग्रेट होना चाहिए हो पाएगा या नहीं हो पाएगा? तो क्या आप अपना कुछ उस पर लास्ट विचार रखना चाहेंगे?
अगर पेरेंट्स के साथ भी हमारा अच्छा रैपो है तो उनकी भी प्रॉब्लम्स हमको समझ में आते हैं, तो कुछ हद तक हम उनके प्रॉब्लम्स को सॉल्व कर सकते हैं या फिर ऑल्टरनेटिव्स उनको दे सकते हैं जो उनको पता नहीं रहता या उनको ध्यान में नाही आता आहे. तर हे आपण करू शकतो की त्यांना पर्याय देणं काहीतरी, किंवा मी अगदी एखाद्याचं टाइम मॅनेजमेंट करून देते, कदाचित कधीतरी फायनान्शियल मॅनेजमेंट पण मी करून देते की तुझी 2 मुलं आहेत, तुला शाळेमध्ये तर फी जात नाही, मग तू एखादा ज्याचा कमी आहे त्याला क्लासला लाव, हे 500 रुपये इथे वापर, असं इतक्यापर्यंत सुद्धा त्यांना थोडंसं जर मदत केली ना, तर काही पालक सुज्ञ असतात, त्यांनाही कळतं की अरे असं करून बघूयात, आणि मग हे होतं. मग आता काही माझे जे 5 स्टुडंट्स आहेत त्यांच्याशी पण मी कॉन्टॅक्टमध्ये आहे. एक माझा केस स्टडीज आहे, म्हणजे की ज्याला मी म्हणजे दत्तक घेतल्यासारखं आहे, की तो आता एक हॉटेल मॅनेजमेंट करतो आहे, आणि ते म्हणजे मला इंटरेस्ट होता की हे किती पुढे जाऊ शकतात, एज्युकेबल आहेत पण हे करत नाहीयेत. हे पण चित्र आहे शहरांमधलं, हे दुर्दैव आहे असं मला वाटतं, कारण प्राईम एरियामध्ये राहून सुद्धा 10 शाळा तुम्हाला जवळ आहेत, सगळं फुकट मिळतंय, सगळं आहे, मग शिक्षण का नाही? म्हणजे आम्ही घरी जाऊन मी गाडीवरनं मुलांना आणलेलं आहे की तुम्हाला सगळं मिळतं, म्हटलं तुम्हाला हक्क हवा शिक्षणाचा, मग आम्ही द्यायला बसलोय, मग तुम्ही घेत का नाही? हे पण केलं पाहिजे ना, नुसतं पालकांना पण ते हलवलंच पाहिजे असं मला वाटतं काही वेळेला. त्यामुळे ते करतो. तर पालकांना सुद्धा थोडं, किंवा पालकांना सुद्धा ते अनस्किल्ड लेबर असतं, त्याच्यामुळे एक तर त्यांनी काहीतरी स्किल शिकायला हवं, पण ते त्याच्या आता एजच्या बाहेर गेलेले असतात. पण ॲटलिस्ट तुला जे काम मिळालंय ते टिकवून ठेव, एवढं जरी सांगितलं. म्हणजे आता जो मुलगा हॉटेल मॅनेजमेंट करतोय त्याला फीमध्ये सवलत आहे, तो ह्याच्यातला आहे रिझर्वेशनमधला म्हणून, पण तरीसुद्धा 30-40 हजार काहीतरी फी आहे. मग त्याला सांगितलं त्याच्या वडिलांना की आता 3 वर्ष त्याचं शिक्षण पूर्ण होईपर्यंत तुम्ही कोणतंही काम सोडायचं नाही, घर बदलायचं नाही, इकडे तिकडे काही डिस्टर्ब करायचं नाही, जेणेकरून तो शिक्षण कंटिन्युअस व्यवस्थित विना अडथळा पूर्ण करू शकेल. निदान एवढं तरी करा, जे तुम्ही केलं नाही ते तुमचा मुलगा करणार आहे, तुमच्या घरातलं कुटुंबातलं पहिलं मूल असणार आहे की जो ग्रॅज्युएट असणार आहे, ह्याचा आनंद तो झाल्यावर पण त्यासाठी आज कष्ट घ्यावे लागतील हे त्यांना जाणीव करून द्यावी लागते. काही जण साथ देतात, काहींना कळत नाही, हळूहळू कळेल. 4 मुलं झाली की 5वा तयार होईल अशा आशेवर आहे, त्यामुळे हे करत राहायचं असं वाटतं. थँक्यू.
We're out of time. Thank you so much, Sandeep, Dr. Shalaka, and Chitra ma'am. Thank you so much.